session with us by posting your questions using the chat function of the webinar platform. As the webinar title, Going Back to Basics, indicates, this is the chance to ask the most basic questions that you were afraid to ask elsewhere. No question is too simple in today's session. With this, let me now introduce you our two speakers. First, I'm introducing Mr. Albert Lai. Albert is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Carbon Care Asia, which is a sustainability consultancy and a certified climate bond verifier based in Hong Kong and Singapore. Albert, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Oh, hello, everyone. Yes, we are pleased to be here, to be meeting all of you. So we've been a climate bonds verifier working with CBI for some time. So we are quite happy to support any green initiatives. In fact, we are a mission-driven business. Our focus is actually to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy. So we hope to be able to have help, and we'll be able to discuss with you in more detail in the next hour.
Thank you, Albert. The other speaker is Climate Bond Initiative's Cedric Rimon. He's been operating from Hong Kong and Singapore for the last, Thailand and Singapore for the last 6 years as an expert in green finance and climate finance. Cedric, please introduce a bit more about yourself.
Hello, everyone. Very nice to meet you all through this video chat. So my name is Cedric Rimon. I'm based in Singapore. I work for Climate Bonds Initiative, and globally, we serve our mission to grow the green bond market, delivering a certification scheme to help align the projects that are funded through climate bonds with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We hope that this session will help you to develop your understanding of the green bond markets. What are green bonds? So no question is too basic. This session is meant to answer all your questions. Yuki, back to you.
Thank you, Cedric. So let's start our discussion. Cedric and Albert, I suggest keeping your responses really short and sharp, and then we can go through a lot of questions. Dear participants, you are welcome to start posting your questions on the chat function. So I'll start with the most basic question to you, Cedric, first. Can you explain the various ways that businesses can raise finance, and where does bonds, not just green bonds, but general bonds fit in?
Sure, Yuki. So let me go back to basic. When a corporation or a project owner is looking to finance a project, the first source of capital is equity financing. That's when the risks of the project are high, the outcome is uncertain, and the repayment of the capital that is invested is unsure. Once the project has developed and there is more certainty about its outcome, the project owner has the possibility to go to a bank and ask for a loan, which is usually only between the bank and the project owner. This is called commercial lending. Once the project is growing and there is more certainty, the project owner may seek some additional financing. But for the bank, it may be a constraint. There must be some limitation on the amount that the bank is able to lend. So another bank may come to the rescue and team with the first bank to finance the project. This is called syndication. Multiple lenders are teaming up together to offer financing for a project. The project owner may then request additional financing, which may exceed the capacity of this group of lenders. And that's where the bond market offers an additional source of financing for large quantity of capital that comes from various types of investors globally. The green bond is very much like any other bond. It can come in various forms, in structured forms. It can be structured, it can be senior, it can be junior, etc. But what matters is the use of proceeds. What is the capital used for? And that's where it is very important that projects that are being financed are clearly identified. And that's how the green bond market is organized, around the definition, the selection of the project, the management of this use of proceeds. And this is a market that since the last 4 or 5 years has been growing very strongly. You can see currently on the screen the amounts that have been issued globally. Last year, they exceeded $250 billion US. And the growth has been very strong in ASEAN as well. Last year, we saw almost a doubling of the amounts issued in the form of green bonds. This is very encouraging. That means that more and more projects get financed that are in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming. This is establishing trust with investors. Investors like the extra transparency. They like the definition of the projects. And they like the alignment between the issuer and the investors.
Thank you, Cedric. We already have one question from the participant. Malik Misra is asking, can a microfinance institution raise green bonds to finance various borrowers working on RE/climate adaptation initiatives, particularly in agriculture? Is there any such examples?
Well, maybe I can help to answer that question partly, and then Cedric can chip in. Now, actually, for green bond issuers, there are primarily two types. One are corporate issuers, companies that actually issue green bonds to finance their own projects. Now, exactly what are the green projects? What qualifies as a green projects? I mean, there are various definitions. For example, the green bond principles, which is a standard for green bond issues issued by the ICMA. They actually listed 10 different project types. But these are kind of examples. So in theory, there's so long as you can demonstrate the green credentials and the environmental contributions of the projects, then there is a good chance that it can be classified as a green bond. Obviously, it has to go through a set of procedures, which I can explain later, or Cedric will also have some slides to go through that later. Now, but the key is that one type is corporate issuers. The other type are financial institutions. A lot of the green bonds are actually issued by banks. Now, they most of these green bonds issued by financial institutions are used to finance multiple projects. So to answer the question from Malik, now if you have a microfinance institution, the key for you is actually to be able to collect or organize a big enough pool of projects. Now, because for green bonds, size is an issue. You can't issue only a couple of $1 million that won't work because of the transaction costs and so on. So generally, probably the very minimum that we have seen is probably around $10 million US, but actually the average is probably over 30, 40 million US dollars. So size does matter. So if there is a certain size, if you can organize micro projects, microfinance projects up to a certain size, let's say around 20, 30 million, then there would be a good chance that you can package this as a good green bond project. Now, agriculture is obviously possible. So the question is what type of agriculture, whether the projects that you intend to lend to can make net contributions to the environment. And that has to go through a process, a project evaluation process. And that again, that would you may need some help from consultants to organize a green bond framework, which defines how you would select those projects, to select those environmentally positive projects, and then if the size is good, is large enough, then you package it to go to the bank and start the process of issuing a green bond.
There is another question on the chat about whether supranational growth has been flat in the past years, as the chart shows. Actually, the green bond market started with supranationals, and the supranationals are an active player in that market. But it's true that other players have been coming in particular in ASEAN. The growth has been coming from non-financial sector and financial sector. So I agree with you, Albert, that the financial institutions are very active in that market, but also non-financial corporations have been quite good issuers in ASEAN, which is very encouraging because it shows that it has a broad interest from different parts of the economy. There's another question here coming in about how liquid is the green bond market, and what is the tenure of the green bonds. Well, the liquidity obviously is a reflection of the general bond market itself. In ASEAN, the bond markets are not that developed yet. So in economic terms, the liquidity may be relatively low, yet we see a very strong interest at issuance when a green bond comes to market. And long-term investors are very strong buyers of these structures. They like the long-term risk profile of the green bonds. And we've seen a very strong uptake of buyers from this pesticide. For example, a green bond has been issued in Thailand for the BTS group. It was 8 times oversubscribed. That means that there was 8 times more investors than there was, the size of the bond was offered. So that's very encouraging as well. Someone is also asking whether blue bonds come under the Climate Bonds Initiative definition. It really depends on whether the use of proceeds fall under our criteria. Our criteria are very detailed definitions on what can be accepted as aligned with the climate bond standard. So the 2 blue bonds that have been issued, I believe, Fiji and Seychelles, do not fall currently under the climate bond standard. They have been issued to preserve coastlines and ocean, for which there is not yet a standard. But we could imagine that in the future, if a new standard is issued for those specific types of assets, or a new green bond is brought to market to, for example, finance marine renewable energy, this could qualify under a criteria.
Yeah, if I may also chip in about the question of liquidity, I totally agree with Cedric's point of view that green bonds now, because if you look at the size of green bonds compared to the entire corporate bond market, it is still a very small portion, and therefore it can be regarded as a scarce commodity, and therefore is just in most cases is highly sought after. I'll give you one piece of evidence now. We all face this coronavirus. We know that how the markets moves, and actually a lot of assets, financial assets, have dropped significantly and so on. But if you look at the performance of green bonds, it can be regarded as a kind of defensive debt, because by the end of March, the Bloomberg Barclays US Green Bond Index is only down 2.5%, compared with a 5.1% drop among all the investment grade corporate debt benchmark. So in other words, green bonds has dropped much less than the general corporate bond markets. So that is an indication that this is an instrument that is well sought after by investors, and therefore, if you are a potential issuer, you can be comfortable that by issuing green bonds, it actually helps you to expand your investor pool, and also it would help to enhance your own corporate reputation as well. Simply because this is a tool, this is a product that investors would like to put their money in.
I agree. The investors are also very much in demand for green bonds because it's in sectors that are less exposed to shifts in the economic cycle or the change that climate change is bringing on to us. For example, you take the coal industry. There's increasing demand that lenders stop lending to coal corporates. The oil industry is currently under a lot of stress due to the rapid fall in the oil price. The airline industry is in trouble also because of the coronavirus. That's true, but that's another external shock, and that's showing investors how much impact it can have on the valuation of corporates, which we thought were relatively strong. So if you translate that into climate change risk, this could also bring similar impact on asset valuations, and that's why investors also like the green bonds, we believe. People ask, someone asked whether the climate bonds require a rating and whether S&P, Moody's, and Fitch rate those green bonds. I think you have to differentiate. A green bond is a bond. So some bonds are rated and some bonds are unrated. Some bonds are privately issued and do not require a credit rating. But if a large issue comes to market, it can be rated by S&P, Moody's, and Fitch like it was any other bond. The fact that it's green, it's an extra layer that is being brought to investor to indicate what is the purpose of the bond. So I think you can differentiate those two aspects. The credit rating serves to give indication about the quality of the borrower in terms of its credit profile, and the climate bond certification or the green bond verification gives an indication on the use of the proceeds. These are two different things in the way the green bond market is organized. And Albert, is Carbon Care Asia is a verifier that is bringing that element of designing what the proceeds are meant to serve.
Yeah, well, maybe I can expand this a bit more since perhaps the question about the rating is probably also related to whether green bonds need to have a special rating system of their own. Now, if this is in your mind, we don't call this a rating, we call this an external review. Now, because unlike ordinary corporate bonds, now green bonds, as the name implies, I mean, in order to give it credibility, the green integrity, there has to be a procedure to make sure that the proceeds raised from the bond issuance we put into green projects, and therefore there is a system in place. Now, the main standards to enforce those systems internationally now is either the green bond principles or the climate bond initiatives, or the climate bond standards. Right. Now, there are some other regional systems. For example, China has their own system, or ASEAN also has ASEAN Green Bond Principles, but ASEAN Green Bond Principle basically is in line with the ICMA Green Bond Principles. So in order to be aligned with those principles, what needs to be done from an issues perspective is that you have to develop a green bond framework that sets out how you select the projects, and then how you use the process, and to ensure that the process will not be leaked into other working capital and so on. And then you would invite a verifier or external reviewer, if you is what we call, to verify that the green bond framework is in line with what you claim to be, right? And then in the case for climate bond standards, we as verifier would submit our report to Climate Bond Initiative, to CBI, and then CBI will look at it and then certify. It gives you a certification. And that certification to you is very important, because then you can take the certification to the investors, and the investors will be assured, this is a proper green bond with a high integrity, and therefore you can establish your reputation in the market. So this is how it's done. So it's not a credit rating by Moody's or S&P, but it is, in a way, it's a verification or certification process that is quite robust.
And Albert, someone is asking, what are the metrics to measure end use or the impact? Is it only carbon emission? So in the work that you're doing in terms of verifying projects, what are the criteria that you're looking for?
Now, if we talk about, I think, again, let's differentiate two types of standards. Now, for green bond principles, we are talking about environmental contribution. Not necessarily, carbon emission is not the only criteria. I mean, sometimes there are projects that would only focus on, say, water saving, right? And that is also an environmental contribution. So you can have different types of projects, or like green building. For green building has, in most cases, have their own certification system, like LEED system or Green Mark in Singapore, or the 3-star systems in China, and so on. So these systems, again, they look at the multiple parameters in addition to carbon emissions. Now, so this is for issuing under green bond principles. If you want to issue it under climate bond initiatives, climate bond standards have their own criteria, each sector by sector. And in fact, in that sense, CBI is climate bond standard is a more robust standard, because it has very well defined sectoral standards. Depending on which sector your project belongs in, you have to go through that. And carbon emission is only one of them, one of the many criteria. But you have to, there's a methodology to assess, whether your project falls into that particular standards. And I may not go through it to too much details here, because again, this is a sector by sector requirements.
So just to come back on the process of issuing green bonds, it starts with the preparation of the bond. Usually the stakeholders who are involved are the issuer or the project sponsor, who chooses the way that the project is going to be financed. They usually work with a bank, what we call an arranger or an underwriter, which is usually a leading investment bank. And the work that starts in the background is to prepare the assets, make sure that the selection is robust, that the framework is in place. What we call the green bond framework is set. And what matters is really how the proceeds are going to be used. The second aspect is to choose against which standard the bonds are going to be issued. In that field, there is a few options for a green bond issuer. The larger one is the green bond principles. They were set in 2014 by ICMA, the International Capital Market Association, and they basically set the stage for green bonds. And that's, it includes, again, the selection, the management of assets, and the reporting as well. The second step is to engage a verifier, which will perform a second-party opinion and provide all the relevant information to investors and this independent view on whether the selection of the assets has been strong and in line with the objectives of the issuance. The third step, if the issuer wants to get the certification for climate bond standards, which is an option, is to submit a file, like Albert said, and then Climate Bonds Initiative will issue this certificate to recognize that the green bond is in line with the criteria that we have issued. This certification happens before and after the issuance of the green bond. So we speak of pre and post issuance. In general, the issuer of a green bond has a period of time to allocate the proceeds of the bond to the financing of those projects. So normally it's in the new standard that we have issued is 24 months. And within 12 months of issuance, the verifier will issue a post-issuance report to report on the allocation of proceeds. And we will confirm that certification to the issuer. And after the green bond has been issued, the issuer can report annually. It is an option under the green bond principles. It is a requirement against under the climate bond standard. So the issuer will report every year to the investors what projects have been selected, how they have been financed, and if some, for example, if some projects have not been financed for a reason or another, there is always the option to finance alternative assets as long as they are also in line with basically the standard against which they have been issued.
Thank you, Cedric. So there's another question on the verifier. Are there approved certifiers or verifiers?
So for the climate bond standard, we ask verifiers to be approved by us. So we select only specific providers of verification that have gone through our assessment. This includes the verification that they have the proper knowledge and the proper staff to basically perform this analysis. They understand the bond market. They are able also to understand the standards against which they verify. And we will do this review and we will only recognize certain verifiers. So for example, Carbon Care Asia is an approved verifier, as are some others. The list is on our website. But in general, verifiers can also issue second-party opinion against the green bond principles without an approval.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from the Q&A section about permanent working capital. Can that be part of a green bond?
So working capital is normally excluded from the use of proceeds.
Unless you're in China. So, as I say, I mean, China use a different standard, right? Okay, so they admit use of proceeds up to 50% in some cases as working capital, but that is not an international standard. So I think for ASEAN countries, ASEAN issuers, you just exclude working capital. I mean, you need to focus on the project. I mean, basically all of the use of the proceeds raised should be used in the project that is verified to be green or environmental contribution. But on the point about verifier, I would like to emphasize one thing is that in quite a few jurisdictions, they try to encourage green bond issues. So there's some subsidy scheme to issuers to subsidize the cost of external review of verification. In Singapore and in Hong Kong in particular, in these two places, they have direct grant scheme to verify to issuers, so that they basically don't have to pay for external review costs or verifier cost.
There is a question on the chat room asking what is the consideration for an issuer to decide if the green bond should be issued in local currency or US dollar, and which stock exchange should it be issued on? In general, obviously, issuers have the choice depending on the pool of capital that is available to them. If they issue in a currency that is not their domestic currency, they may incur some foreign exchange risk. So, despite any consideration on whether the bond is green or not, the decision on the currency is very important in the way the business is financing itself. So it depends on the available pool of capital, the depth of the market, and whether the issuer is happy running this foreign exchange risk or not, and whether it can hedge it. So that's a consideration that is very important, but it's not strictly speaking a feature of the green bond. And likewise, on which stock exchange should it be issued on, it depends on the local regulation. Green bonds can actually, or bonds in general, can be issued on a private basis and don't need to be listed on the stock exchange.
Yeah, I think kind of a connected question to this would be, who are the investors of green bonds, especially in the ASEAN context?
Well, there are many types of investors. Funds in general, there are some dedicated bond funds that invest in bonds, and there are some green bond funds that are emerging that are selectively choosing only to invest in green bonds. There are some exchange traded funds as well that are starting to emerge. We see some rapid growth in those. There are some institutional investors in that field, in that sector. There is a lot of variety of different types of investors. There are pension funds, there are sovereign wealth funds, there are insurance companies that need to invest their capital to offset their liabilities. There are, I guess, retail investors are less active in the space because of the amount of capital they have to put to work, although they can put their investment into funds that are investing in bonds. But in general, this is a market dominated by institutional investors and banks as well.
Yeah. Well, there's a question regarding the use of process. I think some is Hugo. Hugo asked, what do green bond standards require the issuer not to be involved in activities that would make it non-eligible to green bond certificates? Now, I think the answer, there are two levels of this answer. On a strict level, no. The answer is no, because the use of process is actually focused on the projects. Let's say if you are a company say if you're a power utility, you invest in both coal-fired power plants, as well as renewable energy facilities. Then, in theory, you can issue a green bond that invests only in that renewable energy facility, say in a wind farm, right? Okay. If you can make sure that the use of process is limited to the wind farm, that would be fine. That would be acceptable. Okay. So, but on a broader level, investors will also look at the credibility of the company itself, right? I mean, if a company engages in a lot of activities that's very polluting and so on, obviously that would has some impact on the investors. So that's why in terms of the green bond standards or even or climate bond standards, there's no requirement that the issuer cannot be involved in non-green activities. There's no such requirements. Right.
At the same time, we have been very sensitive to companies that have activities that are very much in the brown field, fossil fuel based, or activities that are very polluting, and are looking to issue potentially a small green bond out of all their activities. So if that's the case, we would be very precise on their level of commitment to stop the level of activity that are polluting and their commitment to really transition towards green. So we have been refusing certification, for example, if you have an issuer that is active in a very brown type of activity and continues to grow these activities while seeking a small green bond issuance just to for one of their businesses, for example. So there is some scrutiny at the same time, so that companies that are dependent on fossil fuel activities are not able to just, like we say, use the green bond to do some greenwashing. So that's quite important as well.
Yeah. That's a really important point. Kind of related to this, but more about the post-issuance, is what happens if there is an explicit breach under the green bond standard after post-certification, considered as a default on the bond itself, or the bond is just no longer labeled as green bonds, but just non-rated bonds as it was.
So strictly speaking, the greenness of a bond is not an event of default, or the non-greenness of a bond. So it's not possible to really call a default on a green bond because it's not specified in the covenant. It's just the definition of use of proceed that gives access to this qualification of green or the certification. What we can do though is withdraw the certification if the issuer is financing activities that no longer comply with the original purpose of the green bond. And for the issuer, this is a reputational risk. That means that they will be flagged as an issuer that has promised investors to invest in green bonds, in green projects, sorry, and has not delivered. We had the case, for example, in Mexico, where the airport issued a green bond to build the airport, and then due to a change of government, the project was cancelled. So the green bond were no longer used to finance the construction of the airport. So what the government did is buy back those bonds from investors as the promise of delivering a green airport was no longer there. So that's quite important to establish the trust. And it mostly relies on the reputational risk of the issuer.
Yeah, I wholly agree with Cedric. This is an important point. Although you know, the kind of long green commitments will not become a default for the bond itself, the default event for the bond itself. But there is a big reputational issue here. And that is exactly why whether you follow the green bond principles or whether you follow the climate bond standards, there's a requirement that you have to issue post-issuance report, basically annual report, to document the environmental contribution of your project. I think investors are putting more and more focus on this sort of reports. In fact, we have recently done a research on Asia Pacific green bonds or sustainability bonds, and we found that, you know, quite a number of issuers have delayed their green bond, their annual reports, annual impact reports, and that certainly is not helpful for the reputation of those issuers.
In your experience, Albert, how much discussion is going on with an issuer whenever you are working on a second opinion? How much discussions on the selection of assets, on what can be included, what should be excluded, as well as the corporate strategy that the company is really communicating to the investors?
Now, that varies a lot, but I think from our experience, issuers are very meticulous in terms of selecting their projects because they know full well that I think issuers are genuinely want to maintain a good reputation after the issuance agreement, because bonds is a kind of a long-term, relatively is a long-term debt. So you're talking about at least usually 3 years or even up to 10 years, and so for issuer, what we found is that they would be quite keen to make sure that whatever they commit to do can be done at the corporate level, and that's why most issuers will be very careful when they design or develop the green bond framework to integrate the requirements or the commitments in the green bond framework with their own business strategy. So by integrating the business strategy with the green bond framework, then they can be internally, they can be certain, you know, that the commitment can be met. And we find this. We spend a lot of time helping some issuers to actually develop the green bond framework. And in fact, that is a significant part of the exercise. It's not just the issuing itself. So the pre-issuance work is very important to make sure that the whole process is smooth, because you only want to commit what you can commit and don't overcommit. And once that is clearly understood, that would make the whole issuance process much smoother.
So someone is asking whether a coal-fired power plant, which would be looking to install solar power rooftop would be able to issue a green bond. Under the ASEAN Green Bond principles, fossil fuels are excluded, and under our standard as well. So this could not be possible because this would just be an addition to their existing business, which is very brown in nature. For a coal-fired power plant to be able to consider anything, it would have to commit to stop its activity that is polluting and demonstrate its commitment long-term. And we see it, for example, under the green building standard, where our standard is organized around a pathway towards zero net carbon emission at a horizon in the future. So what we do is we take the 15% best in class in a location that is demonstrated through a building standards, for example, and we draw a contribution in terms of net carbon emissions, and this should converge towards zero by a certain amount of time for it to qualify under our standard. So it's really about transforming the way business is done, how businesses are polluting the environment, and finding a transition from existing practices towards activities that are not polluting. I don't know, Albert, if you've come across of similar businesses that are very brown and are seeking in the green bond market to get some financing.
Yes, I can give you some example. Unfortunately, this is an area that cannot be fully taken care of by the standards itself. Sometimes you really need common sense. I mean, you really need to go back to the first principles. Now, I mean, for instance, in Hong Kong, there is the Hong Kong Airport Authority is pursuing a third one-way project. Now, as we all know, if you build a third one-way, obviously there will be a much more air traffic and much higher carbon emissions and so on, and that can, there's a lot of studies to prove that. Now, and then at the same time, for the airport authority, when they build the third one-way, they will also be building a terminal, extra terminal. Now, and that terminal, they can go for a green bond issues because the terminal itself, if they design it properly, they can get some green building standards certified. Now, so now the question remains: okay, you can issue a green bond to support a green building in a project, whereas that whole project itself could be quite polluting, right? So how do you balance it? Now, I think there are two sides of the story. I mean, one can argue that, okay, now if an authority is going to build a third one-way anyway, you'd rather that they build a green building than not do a green building. But on the other hand, one can also argue that, okay, this green bond issue, the process to go into a project, which as a whole may not meet the strict criteria for green bond standards. So I think you can still find controversies in those areas, and that's why what we are doing here, collectively, is actually a project in progress. I mean, the standards, I'm sure, will be improved over time, and the practices will also be improved over time.
Yeah, thank you. Can we move on to another topic, which is about finding the investors? So there were two questions that are phrased differently, but one is from Paul saying, what role can CBI play in introducing corporates to new pools of investors? And the other one was from someone else asking whether there are any information about understanding what investors are interested in.
So the whole purpose of the verification, the second opinion, and the certification that we provide is to reassure investor that the due diligence has been done to select projects that are in line with the green objectives. So in doing that, we really increase the visibility that issuers have so that investors who really want to put their money to work towards green projects can find them more easily. So in the general course of doing this work, we are increasing access to investors. And what we hear from treasurers is that indeed they see an increasing interest. Like I said, the BTS group issued a bond that was 8 times oversubscribed, or the Indonesian government issued 2 green sukuk transactions, and they accessed 39% more investors than their normal sukuk program. So it's a demonstration that investors are actually coming towards those markets because they want to invest in green. And if you are a fund manager sitting in Northern Europe and you're looking for green assets, you may consider to go to Southeast Asia and go to Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, if some green bonds are issued and they satisfy global standards. And that's actually very important. I saw another question in the chat room as well on whether there should be a local taxonomy. Obviously, having a local taxonomy help develop more interest from local players. But at the same time, being able to harmonize this local taxonomy with global standards is very important as well, because global investors will not spend the time to study the local taxonomy to make sure that it's compliant with the global standards. So if a green bond can be issued according to a global standard, like the climate bond standard or the green bond principles, it will help in the visibility to investors. And we really do see this interest. And we just issued a report, a treasury survey that we did. And it's a demonstration through our questions that investors are really interested in green bonds.
Yeah, well, on the question of local taxonomy, I think that is that is an interesting discussion. Now, because I think for most issuers, when you issue a bond, you would like to attract not just local investors, you would like to attract international investors. So that's why it's important to adhere to a high standard that is acceptable by investors. I mean, now, but having said that, there's already some local taxonomy, like as I mentioned in China, because there's a big country, they have their own standards, they have their own taxonomy, and the taxonomy includes clean coal technology and also nuclear plants as well, and also big hydropower. Now, these are projects that would not be recognized by international investors as green projects. So that's why international investors are very worried about the green bond market in general. Now in China, I'm not saying that they don't invest in China. I'm saying that because of this difference in taxonomy, that would add a layer of reluctance, and that's why actually recently Carbon Care Asia has partnered with Selective. We issue a Asian Sustainability Bond Index, and a key methodology to formulate that index is to filter out bonds that do not meet good international practices and good international standards. So that's why if you are thinking of issuing a green bond using some sort of local taxonomy that are way apart from international best practice, it may be a futile effort, because then it may not be welcomed by international investors.
There is a question on whether there is a website or resource to know about the investors interested in a particular geographic location and their preferences to invest on the issuance of the bonds. And also, from which site or resource can we obtain more information about green bonds issued so far? So in terms of investors, there is no such website, but the main asset managers now starts to have dedicated strategy to invest in green bonds. And the role of the arranger or the underwriter in the issuance process is critical in knowing where to sell those bonds. And the larger investment banks will be able to help the issuer to access those investors. And we hear, for example, the Japanese government pension fund is allocating a portion of their $1.5 trillion of investments to green bonds. IFC and Amundi have launched a $1 billion green bond fund as well. And we see more and more initiatives like these ones to create dedicated vehicles that will invest in green bonds. On the question of where can we find information on green bonds themselves, on the website, on our website, climatebonds.net, we actually maintain a library of green bonds. So you can, it's free to access. You can go there and see every month what kinds of green bonds have been issued. And for the ones that we have reviewed, we have a 2-page basically data sheet where we explain the proceeds, which standard they have been issued against, and so on. So there is a wealth of information available to learn more about examples of green bonds that have been issued. And it's very helpful in coming up with new ideas in the market as well.
Right. Well, I may also like to answer one question from a participant from Nepal. I think he asked about, I think it's Sanjit. He asked about what are possible green bond issues in emerging economy like Nepal, you know, when the currency is not convertible and there's high transaction costs and so on. Now, I do recognize, you know, there are difficulties in that, I mean, in this sort of financial markets. But my suggestion is that, you know, if in these cases, when you find it difficult to issue probably corporate bonds in general, not just green bonds, then maybe you can also look at possibility of issuing green loans, not just green bonds. Now, because for green loans is basically a bilateral deal, you know, with the banks or between lenders and borrowers. So the hurdle is less, and that the size can be less as well. I mean, for emerging economy, I mean, you may not want, you know, tens of millions of bonds, but, you know, let's say if you need only a couple of millions of loans, I mean, that would the green loans will be more appropriate. Green loans, there's a green loan principles which is quite similar to green bond principles, and that you know, you know, if you approach the right banks, I mean, they will be happy to talk to you to make sure that things can be done. And there are different variations in green loans as well. And that can also be kind of sustainability linked loans, for instance, whereas the issue of the loans can be, you can get incentives for rebate, you know, if your company can meet certain ESG criteria and so on. So there are different variations of that, and that would probably make it easier for emerging economies.
Yeah, thank you. So we still have loads of questions that are coming in, but we only have 5 more minutes. So I think we should start by asking some closing remarks from the speakers. So maybe starting with Albert, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to highlight that the whole rationale of green bonds is that, you know, following the Paris Agreement and also facing the huge environmental challenge that we have in every countries, we know that there is, to tackle those challenges, we need huge resources to be put into green projects. I mean, one estimate is that for ASEAN, we need at least 200 billion a year up to year 2030 to be put into green projects. So the question is, how do we shift the funds into green projects? So and we do need to tackle this, you know, in multiple ways, whether it's big or small. And therefore, I think it is kind of a developing areas, and that green bond principles basically have set out a procedure which is rigorous but not prohibitive. I would say that if the issues are genuinely want to focus on investing into projects that have environmental contributions, then we can always find a way to make sure that the criteria can be met, and then the extra costs can be minimized, you know, through government subsidies and so on. So I hope that, you know, that there are more issues coming into play. I mean, not just for, it's not just a commercial consideration. It's actually something that is quite essential when you look at the huge climate challenge, environmental challenge we face. So we are here to help. So if there's anything we can offer our advice, I mean, by all means, I mean, you can email me and my colleagues at Carbon Care Asia.
Thank you, Albert. And Cedric, would you also, in your closing remarks, maybe refer to how the COVID crisis will affect the outlook on green bonds?
Sure, Yuki. Well, we have seen last year a tremendous growth already of the green bond market. Like I said, in ASEAN, it grew by 100%. And we saw a lot of diversity in issuance, in type of issuers, in projects that are being funded. And beyond green bond, we saw also the emergence of other thematic bonds like social bonds or sustainability bonds or SDG-linked bonds. And now through this crisis, we see pandemic bonds as well. There has been a lot of issuance in China, for example, or the government of Indonesia has issued a large sovereign issue as well for the fight against the pandemic. So in general, what this crisis is telling us is that an external shock, like a virus or like climate change, can really shake our society. But we have the financial tools to fight it. And the green bonds is the perfect instrument to fund projects that are, in response to these threats. And we have a market that is now well organized. The regulators have done a lot of work in setting the regulation that is conducive to more green bond issuance. So going forward, we expect the continuation of the growth. The market is very active. We see a lot of requests coming in. At Climate Bonds Initiative, we are not for profit and we are there to serve the market. So we can answer your queries. We can accompany you. We can bring you to talk to other people in our network as well and answer your questions. This week, there is another webinar that we organize on the Thursday, the 30th of April, for the launch of our Green Infrastructure Investment Opportunities report in Vietnam and the update report on Indonesia. These are two important reports that we are publishing to highlight the areas where green bonds could finance resilient infrastructure in both Vietnam and Indonesia. This is very important. I hope that you can join those webinars. There will be more webinars organized around other topics. So I would like to thank you, Albert, for joining me today on this session, and Yuki for moderating. This is very exciting, and we had a lot of registrations for this webinar. So we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you. With this, we'd like to end this session, and thank you very much for all your questions. And we hope that we can see you in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.